Welcome to Lore Citizen, a podcast dedicated to all things Star Citizen lore. If you enjoy this, make sure that you like, subscribe, and follow all of our social medias. Without further ado, let's get started. Welcome to whatever this is right now. I don't even know what the name of it yet is. This is a long-requested feature that many fans of Galactic Historian have asked me to do. And I've talked with Al about this a long time about doing this, and I've talked with Jale about this in the past. And I've decided, you know what? I just got to pull the trigger and do it. Just gotta do it. Just do it. You know.
The Historians Council.
The Historians Council. The rhetoric, whatever you want to call it. We'll figure this out. Yep. So, let me give you the basic gist of this. This will probably change over time. So if you're watching this in the far future and you're like, wow, this is nothing like I'm used to now, that's because this is the first one. So things are going to change a little bit. But the general idea is to bring people in who like Star Citizen lore and discuss aspects of Star Citizen lore that are interesting or unique, or things that you don't often see discussed because they are too complicated or they require a lot of interconnectedness. And so I picked a topic this week based off of some input from the other two folks on the panel today, and of course from you, the viewer. I did some polls and got some information. And yeah, so let's get started with introductions. Let's start with you, Jale. Who are you and what do you do in Star Citizen?
I'm Jale. I have a YouTube channel where I mostly talk about alien languages. I'm one of the people who bothers to learn Xi'an and Banu. And I also I have a lot of hobbies and I just tie them into Star Citizen in various weird ways. So right now I'm trying to make a series about using my profession as a biologist to look at aliens. And also I'm trying to map the verse with maths, make maps of the planets.
Woo! There we go. Yeah. So here's the question. I'll ask you the big question because I know it bothers you. Do you think that anybody at CIG has ever actually looked at what DNA and cloning is like?
I know for a fact that one of the people at the UK office has a degree in biology, and I hope that she pulls her hair out. But yeah, no, we can have a whole other kind of conversation about that. We'll have an entire episode of just letting Jale rant about how CIG doesn't understand how cloning works. I'm sure they'll come up with a very good explanation in the end. We're just hearing it in progress.
Yeah. All right, and next you have the old man, one of the old men of Star Citizen. The leader of or the owner and operator of Crazy Al's Discount Space Shop. Algrid.
We don't sell discount ships. Sorry, that's only the medium.
Premium ships.
Premium.
Crazy Al's premium spaceship.
That's right. Premium used chips.
Yeah, and they don't even say depot. They say depot. You have to use the French kind of pronunciation.
It's like Woolsworth.
Yeah.
Woolsworth or Target.
Yeah. Al, who are you? What do you do in Star Citizen, and where can they find you?
I'm Al Garrett. I'm probably most known for being one of the Infra Runners, where we talk all things Star Citizen, and probably known best for our mantra of sell your fighters and go big and work down. Lately, I've been doing just a Toon and an Aurora, and just doing gameplay and that. Really enjoying flying the Aurora. I didn't think I'd enjoy it as much as I have.
Nice.
So out with everything, flying an Aurora. There you go.
Hey, flying an Aurora and Mustangs and Auroras are really fun to fly. They just get overlooked because everyone's like, oh, those are just the starter ships. It's like they've got some pretty cool stuff to them. All right, so let's talk about the topic for today. So the topic for discussion today, which we kind of worked together behind the scenes before this got started and factored it in. So we each picked up two major things that we wanted to talk about. But the challenge for today was to discuss about the two most important things that a player should know, a player of Star Citizen should know about the lore of humanity between today, the 21st century, and the discovery of the first jump points. So kind of like from quantum drives to jump points. And so each of us picked 2 topics that we're going to go over. You're going to have them go over for a few minutes, discussing their topic, and then a few minutes later, Al and I will jump in and discuss, add or ask questions to kind of clarify. One of these topics is going to be more for the lore and story side of things, and the other one's going to be more in terms of how it impacts gameplay. And just in our discussion to bring up the topic in the first place, we discovered there's a couple of very interesting threads that have been weaved through the lore, which may come back, which actually ripple all the way from the early lore all the way to the game today, especially around Synth World. So let's get started with, I think, Jale, you had the first topic for us.
Sure. Yeah. I think one of the most important things to understand is overpopulation. It's a theme that kickstarts this whole era, and it keeps coming up later in the lore as well. So it's let's dig into that. Yeah.
Go right on.
Yeah. So I just to contextualize this. That's right. So to contextualize this is a quote from the United Nations report on world population from 2019. So from an estimated 7.7 billion people worldwide in 2019, the medium variant projection indicates that global population could grow to about 8.5 billion in 2030, 9.7 billion in 2050, and 10.9 billion in 2100. More than half of the projected increase of the world population up to 2050 will be concentrated in just 9 countries, including the United States of America. So, bringing this into the lore of Star Citizen, the period from 2038 to 2157 is known as the human overpopulation era. Those dates correspond to a start date in our near future, around when the United Nations predict that the world population will reach 9 billion, and the era ends with the successful colonization of Mars. So this era is a period of immense challenges and existential threats for the human race. A growing population on a world with diminishing resources naturally leads to conflict. Nations strove to find their own solutions to this pressing problem, leading to a rise in eugenics, water wars, and even genocide and ethnic cleansing. The quality of life for everyone just plummets. The population is packed into teeming megacities, with natural food becoming scarce and mass-produced synthetic foodstuffs becoming the staples of an ordinary human's diet. The situation becomes so dire that in the eastern nations, which would one day form the state of Asiatica, much of the natural landscape is dug up in favour of superstructures and skyscrapers. Natural wonders previously under protection were bulldozed for settlements or arable land, and countless species become extinct. It's said, I think it's quite a nice snappy quote to contextualise the whole century, in the late 21st century, even the richest and most powerful people on the planet couldn't hoard the most valuable of resources, which was space. Now, humanity could have turned inwards on itself and fought each other to death for the last scraps of our homeworld, but instead we entered into the 22nd century with a sense of optimism and purpose to reach outwards. There are enormous advances in every field of human endeavour, as we'll discuss, culminating in the successful terraforming and colonization of Mars, which marks the end of this era. So this theme of civilization growing beyond its means and its living room is a recurring motif in the lore of Star Citizen beyond even this first era. It drove humanity to move beyond the sphere that bore us and explore the stars, but it's also cited as the driving factor for the Tavaran to attack humanity, which both sealed their fate and led to us becoming a fascist empire. Humanity never actually never learned how to stop expanding, though, and had it not been for the discovery of the first jump point, there might have been a second overpopulation era. And there's some academics in the late 30th century, when the game is set, arguing that humanity is once again on a collision course with the boundaries of our current limits. Only this time, we don't have that drive and political will to innovate beyond those limits as we did in the 22nd century.
Awesome. So what you're saying is that like one of the major themes of the game is going to be overpopulation. It already is overpopulation, but it will start seeing that even more.
Yeah, I think that it's a theme that they've come back to a number of times. They've come back to it with humanity and the Tavaran, at least. And they're coming back to it with humanity again And as you say, that kind of links into the synth world question.
Okay. So I would also like to it's really important to not to can't overestimate overemphasize the fact that this is a huge problem in early lore. Everything human endeavors seem to be almost solely driven to alleviating this problem. So almost all technological progress in early human history from the 2030s all the way up to the 22nd and 23rd centuries seem to be focused on where do we keep all these people and how do we get these people to get off of Earth.
Well, even when you look at the law document from 2460, Brief 3, which is a RSI's advertising campaign to get people to leave Earth and go west, young man. And part of the discussion says, when's the last time you sat in a real park? And there's just the idea that there's no space on Earth, even then, is just really big. So it's not that idea of there not being any space and there not being any room and the need to spread out is not just limited to that point. You see that right the way through the early history of the Star Citizen universe, and it really does make it imperative that we do understand those types of things. The problem with that idea that Earth is heading towards that overpopulation situation again really seems strange when you look at the Stanton system, where the mega planets, those super Earths, are relatively unpopulated. And that could just be because they're corporately owned as well. But certainly that theme of overpopulation does underline that the whole history that we've got being developed and grown through the universe, isn't it?
Yeah, so that opinion, and it is voiced as an opinion, comes from an article which is in the Showdown series. So it's two different experts arguing the toss on it. And it's kind of treated a bit as a fringe view, with the other expert saying, this is ridiculous. We've got loads of unterraformed world. We've got loads of, pristine land. But that was the case for Earth at one point. And humans grow exponentially. It is an ultimate problem if you start running it. Humanity is now walled in on all sides as far as we're aware. We haven't found a jump point series where we're just going undiscovered system after undiscovered system. You've got Xi'an to one side, Vandal to another. So I think that it should be it clearly is in the minds of the writers that nothing is limitless. There is always a limit.
Scarcity will be a thing even deep in the future, kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's certainly something that is there, that sense of there is limited space, and even we're being pushed by the Vandal. The Vandal are struggling for space, and so they're pushing against us.
And the Vandal are almost the purest representation of this sort of resource consumption, because they rock up in the system and they mulch the whole place down for non-specific resources. And that, I think, is also tied into this idea of our relationship to the resources of space, but also the resources in a space.
Yeah. And then you've got the Xi'an where there was that line drawn in the sand, you're terraforming our world, bang. That's it. No further.
So so this is a good example of how, if you understand the early lore of how overpopulation is a thing, you can start drawing that through line all the way out to, for instance, the Xi'an human conflicts, the Cold War. You can talk about the human Xi'an negotiations of the Perry Line was a huge deal. There was one system, I think it was Oya, that they were like, no more. We want this system. The Xi'an were like, we want this system. And humanity was like, it's full of resources. We want this system. And there was a huge back and forth over these issues. So it's obvious that, at least in terms of the story, we have to understand that the constant threat of overconsumption and and crowding is becoming a huge problem in the 30th century, and it has always been there since the 21st century in the Star Citizen universe. I'm going to move on because I want to keep this discussion going. I'll start off with my next topic, which is actually a company that was founded specifically to solve this problem, which is Roberts Space Industries. So it was incorporated in 2038 by Chris Roberts, and that's right, Chris Roberts put himself in the game, his goal was to advance space science. But in order to do that, he first needed to expand other resources, other sciences, as a means to help curb the critical mass of overpopulation. Chris Roberts was very, very concerned about overpopulation and felt that space was the only answer. So, in fact, the first ever RSI products was a hyper-efficient battery converter for ground-based civilian vehicles, and compact water for purification systems to an energy-efficient power network, and even a small expansion into cricket farming, because food had become so scarce that crickets became a means of protein. So being able to build crickets, a farm that could harvest crickets. This is not too outlandish. This is something that's existing today, where people are looking to things like bugs as a means of protein augmentation, because they breed really fast and you can get a lot of them and put them into some food. So it really wasn't until 2061 when Chris Roberts came across the study of a young gung-ho engineer by the name of Dr. Childress, who came up with a theory for what was called the quantum core engine. I'm going to go over the basic fundamentals of it, because there's also a bunch of other things about it, but essentially how the quantum engines work is they fold space in front while retracting space behind. So they work similar to what's called the Alcubierre drive, or the modern warp drive, or the warp drive you see in like Star Trek, where they warp space in front and stretch space behind them. So the idea was that with the quantum engine was to build this as a means to go faster and to expedite the expansion into the universe. And in 2075, after some trial and error, Dr. Childress and Chris Roberts announced to the whole world that they had developed the first quantum core engine. This quantum core engine would eventually become standard for all ships, and is in fact the great ancestor to all modern quantum drives. Beyond that, because Chris Roberts wasn't just interested in the aspects of how to put this, he wasn't just interested in space science, he was also interested in solving this problem of mass critical overpopulation. In fact, the core tenets of RSI's philosophy are: learn from the past, reach for the future, fuel innovation, cultivate talent, and always be relevant. So the next step after developing the quantum drive was to terraform Mars. And they spearheaded development into terraforming technologies, which would eventually lead to Mars's terraformation. But I'll leave that up to Al to kind of talk a little bit more about. But it's really, I can't underestimate the importance that RSI plays, from not just the initial quantum engines and not just Mars's development, but they are the ones who build some of the first commercial spaceships, the Zeus, the RSI Zeus, soon after the Mars tragedies, the Mars terraformations. And they would continue to build most of the major commercial and public spaceships up until about the formation of the UNE. So almost all products, possibly even space suits and terraforming, the terraforming technology, the spaceships, the spacesuits, just about anything that has to do with space travel, likely was built by RSI during this time period we're talking about, during this era. So.
Yep. And the other thing that really sticks out with RSI is the fact that back in the early period, they were almost seen like they'd have been like the consolidated outland. The idea of a ship for every person. That's what the Zeus was. It was the idea of getting a ship that everyone could have, not just the rich people.
It's important to remember that the Zeus was expensive. We're not talking about like...
Yeah.
The Zeus wasn't something that like you could just... It's not like the equivalent of a modern day car. It would be like the equivalent of like mortgaging a house, you know, for at the time.
But it was still within the realms of everybody being able to acquire one.
Yeah.
The idea of a ship in every garage, it was that type of.
Yeah, you don't need a government grant.
Yeah,
it's within your reach.
Yeah, it's not you know, like buying a battleship or something like that. It was something every person could acquire, and that is really significant in terms of looking at human exploration, human expansion, reducing that overpopulation situation. It really is the key component. It's one of the reasons I don't like Consolidated Outland. I just think they're riding on the coattails of RSI constantly.
It's interesting how you raise this sort of idea of corporate personality, which I think they run through. They try to give their corporations some amount of personality, and as you say, you know, Consolidated Outline are trying to take that idea of being like the new upstart disruptors. But something that always strikes me about RSI is that they're one of the few long-lived corporations that is portrayed as being fundamentally benign. I don't think there's much like with the other ones where they sort of get into the dirty that they do. If anything goes bad, it's more of a mistake with RSI, probably because it's a self-insert, right?
Yeah. Well, I think that's important to understand. I think it's important to understand, but it's also important to understand that with RSI, the concept beyond it just being kind of a self-insert for Chris Roberts is also that it is one of the granddaddies of all spaceship manufacturing. And, you know, in the universe of Star Citizen, it is very easy for you to lose everything very quickly. And several of the companies that even exist today in Star Citizen were once defunct companies like Tumbril, you know. So, and even Anvil is the ancestor of the old Case Aerospace. So in a universe where you live 150 years, many companies barely live 5. And to be a company like RSI sticking around for almost
millennium,
you know, a millennium, you're talking about a company that has the right ideas from the start. And so it's always it's supposed to be this old but mostly well-run company, if that makes sense.
Old but reliable. Yeah. And that's really interesting because there's very few of those companies that actually do span the hundreds of years of history in Star Citizen. RSI is not the only one, though. There are others out there, and they're all quite unique and all kind of fit a niche, and all of them certainly do have an impact upon things that are happening in the game or in the background of the game that most people don't, you know, most of us don't even forget as we're thinking about it, and certainly I'm pretty certain there were aspects in as we were doing the reading and looking around for the topic, as these topics were finding little bits that I'd forgotten that or didn't know that. So yeah, there's lots out there that it's just buried in lots of gems in the dirt or the dross.
Well, one of the new bits that came out with I think it was the new tranche of stuff for Galactopedia was they wrote in a predecessor to Shubin Interstellar, or one of the things that Shubin Interstellar brought up, called Worldmaker. And just out of this little sort of snippet, we get this idea that the mid-22nd century, when they're terraforming Mars, yes, the old law says that RSI is the big daddy of it all, but there's a boom of like other little companies that come out, including this one, Worldmaker, which actually is supposed to be from the early 2100s. So that's kind of, I think, interesting as we see the development that maybe this period, which we're currently talking about, will get fleshed out a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
Well, certainly, in terms of the terraform, you've also got the defunct Gold Horizon, which were renowned. You know, they used to build the gold places like the Gold Horizon Station. I think that's like what one of the Pyro Station is, an old Gold Horizon Station. Yeah, they were basically terraforming stations. They were places where people lived when terraforming was going on. And so it's not just RSI doing that type of stuff. There were other companies that actually, again, jumped onto the bandwagon and in that great exploration and expansion of humanity.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Why don't we move on? Let's move on from this to talk about Mars, the next major subject. Since RSI was the thing that essentially enabled Martian colonization, Martian terraformation. Let's talk about Mars itself and its role in this time period.
Yeah, so when you look at Mars, you're really looking at the hubris of humanity. That's probably the start point there. The idea of settling Mars is not new. It's something even in the 20th century and the 21st century we're talking about. Large-scale settlement of Mars, though, is not possible even in the Star Citizen universe until Dr. Childress and RSI developed that first sustainable quantum drive in 2075. Now, just to put that into concept or into context, Dr. Childress' first sustainable light drive, quantum drive was 1/100th of light speed. Now, that gives us a distance to Mars from being 7 to 8 months to a little over a day. And so that development of that quantum drive really does enable those permanent settlements on Mars to be actually established and the scientific communities to be established and built up. It also means that when you're starting to go towards terraforming, you can actually get those supplies and equipment and tools there rather quickly, even rather than waiting one delivery every 8 months or so. So even though you could set up settlements and even though you could set up space stations in and around the system and enable people to go on holidays and see the volcanoes on Io or go to the orbital platform above Neptune, and we're not having terraforming until 2113 when RSI announced, hey, we've developed a new machine that can process the atmosphere of the planet and convert it to sustainable oxygen environment, i.e. terraforming. And there is a news article in Spectrum where they're looking at and arguing, should we even bother? Why are we acting like gods? Are we being overambitious here? And when Earth goes into the process of deciding, the combined Earth governments say, yes, we will actually do this. We need to solve this problem of overpopulation. In 2130, the governments of Earth finally pool their resources and they say, yes, we're going to terraform Mars. And so they send teams of scientists and surveyors to the planet. It was, as the comment goes, it was our first top-down or top-to-bottom exploration of our nearest planet, and the governments of Earth weren't going to leave anything to chance. It reminded me of Jurassic Park. We spared no expense. And unfortunately, in 2125, just as the project was nearing its completion, there was a miscalculation within the terraforming process, which caused the oxygen-rich atmosphere to collapse. As one employee said, the atmosphere didn't stick. And as a result of that, you've had all 4,000, I think 4,800 odd people working on Mars at that time perish. No one was wearing their life suits, no one was wearing their respirators, all the airlocks were open because everyone was thinking, hey, we've got this, it's going to be finished in 2 days. Even though it was against safety guidelines and protocols, because everything was open and no one was wearing suits and everything else, 4,876 scientists and engineers and other people perished. Did that deter humans? Not at all. As a result, they said, we'll do it again. And but it wasn't until 2157 that they finally succeeded in establishing an oxygen-rich atmosphere on Mars, and that enabled not only just those permanent small settlements in under domes, but also people to be able to walk on the planet and farm the planet and have it as a second Earth. And that really is the first valve that enables humans to spread out and no longer be contained or constricted to our solar system or to Earth. It enables us to move out and change and move things and settle on Mars. So there you go.
Right.
All right. I think there's a couple of things in Mars that people should really also know about, which is like Stella Fortuna and the first extrastellar child or extraterrestrial child. Both of those happen in March as there's celebrations, and Stella Fortuna itself, which is actually a celebration that was done by Martians when the travel time from Earth to Mars was at its shortest. So they would send supplies at the shortest. They could send it, I guess, in a day, but they could.
You can do it in
hours.
If you know, if you're talking in terms of the light speed engine, I think rough calculation was like 25.5 hours instead of 7 or 8 months. So at the shortest, when the planets are in their closest alignment, you're probably looking at that even being a slightly shorter period.
Yeah, slightly shorter. But this time period is this time period when they would get their a lot of resources, and they'd have a big celebration on Mars about all of this stuff coming in. And of course, the first child born out of off of Earth is a big deal too, because it proved that humanity was able to expand. And again, going back to that first topic that Jale talked about, this is like the reason why humans went to Mars was because of how bad things were on Earth, just how horrible life conditions were on Earth. Just having land, even if it's unarable garbage land like on Mars before terraformation, was a huge deal. And this trying to not just get land open, but to allow people to expand in that land, to become more to get them there, to encourage them to go, was a big deal.
And people were still reticent about going. I suppose the idea of that Martian tragedy was always still at the back of people's heads. Can we trust this? But the big advantage, the big push was always, you can have your own land, you can have your own block, you can have your own house, you can have your own garden, you can have, and that was stuff you can't do on Earth. Even the richest people on Earth would struggle to find a park where they could sit in. Go to Mars, you can not only have a park, you can have a forest if you like. That's that type of promise that's given by terraforming.
It's just the promise also of it is the first place where we really have a free living, freestanding colony, and it's the first time in a couple of centuries. When you think about the perspective now, you're not feeling like that humanity is fundamentally tied to one dying rock. That we could go beyond that, and that's what Mars, I think, represents to me in the lore. This opening of a chapter.
This promise, the promise of a future.
And,
it always reminds me of Babylon 5. Sorry, Paul.
Yeah. I was going to say, I was even saying with like that brings me back to Stella Fortuna. Like the reason why Stella Fortuna was resurfaced later was because it was a Martian holiday. It would be the equivalent of like a regional holiday on Earth, like the U.S. Independence Day, or Thanksgiving. Actually, Thanksgiving is probably a better example. Like U.S. Thanksgiving, is celebrated this time of year or whatever. But then it was brought back later in UEE history and human history as an attempt to encourage people to go boldly, to go forth and to explore. But before that, it was a Martian holiday. The idea of trying to get people to come to Mars was big, and like exploration and hope for humanity in the future, kind of thing.
And even the naming of Stella Fortuna was by a competition on Mars among school children. So it was an idea to include everyone in this holiday, this naming of this event, where we're looking at the good fortune, and you can see why it ties in, ends up being tied in with St. Patrick's Day, because the idea of good fortune and luck and those things. But you also see it tied in with things like marriage proposals will often happen on that day. Businesses will announce there's or registrations or things around the same time, because it's seen as being that kind of, there's almost a religious aspect or a faith type aspect. If I do it around this time, then I'll succeed, or There's almost a
superstition, at least.
A superstition linked to it, isn't there?
Yeah. I think another interesting thing that this shows us about the attitudes of human civilization in Star System is that Mars is not simply set up as a projection of an Earth society. It's set up as a society that's going to be allowed to develop itself, and it's going to be allowed to have its own traditions and cultures. And Mars didn't end up just as a sort of colonial backwater or a finger of an Earth government. It was there creating and inventing on its own. It was Martian scientists who started the second nuclear age in history, and it was they were innovating in and of themselves, not just as a part of, say, like the American colony or whatever.
Yeah. There is definitely kind of this aspect that it's humanity seems to, in the Star System universe, humanity seems to look at Mars and go, we need to stop. We need something that can unite us, and Mars can unite us. Yeah. Our goal to make a new Earth on Mars is our collective goal as a species, rather than just being separate nations. So
exactly. Yeah, I think another topic that really comes up with Mars that is important in other parts of history and other parts of the world is the danger and the awesome power of terraforming, because this isn't the only terraforming disaster. I mean, the Mesa era falls from terraforming being used as a genocide weapon. Mesa in the Mesa era, 27th century, they're trying to develop terraforming as a weapon, and the Xi'an lost their entire homeworld to not a terraforming disaster per se, but weaponized terraforming technology. So Mars is humans' first time of having their hand on the stove on that one, but it's not the last. It's by any means.
No, and we see that even in the lore. We've got Broken Moon, which is a result of a terraforming disaster. We've got even Microtech. The reason Microtech is so cold is because of a terraforming miscalculation. Yeah. And so with numerous accounts out there, and I did come across a third and a fourth terraforming miscalculation with in the lore, and I just can't remember what systems they were in.
Well, there's the one in where Tumbril came from, where it accidentally became a desert, and there's lots of like the little ones. But, yeah, that's the one. But there's also these little ones, but there's also just this also appreciation that it can be weaponized, and it can be, it has been tied to genocide. It's quite,
and we can wipe out.
This tool of creation can also be used for destruction.
Yeah,
very well put.
And even as we turn it to, I suppose, the idea of we're turning the systems to support our own species as we spread like a virus. And I suppose that was the biggest thing with the encounter with the Xi'an. Here we are, humans going to terraform the planet and start terraforming this planet so it's suitable for us. And the Xi'an are going, hey, what are you both on about? You're going to kill us. You're going to kill us.
I can imagine that being even more traumatic for the Xi'an, knowing their own history of losing their planet to weaponized terraformation. The idea that humans the first contact with humans is, hey, we're going to weaponize and terraform this planet. That's yours.
Yeah, you can almost say it as almost you are declaring war on us. Come on, get real.
Yeah.
I'll just clarify before I get anybody jumping down my throats in the comments section. It was the Xi'an thing was an accident, I think, as well. Yeah. But it was, they were trying to be a bit more subtle with it and assassinate someone and accidentally set fire to the whole planet. It's like, oops. So rather unfortunate. Happens.
Yeah, we'll tackle the Xi'an at some point, and Jale will
I look forward to it.
That. But yeah, the Xi'an have a lot of history, which is surprising because you don't find them very easily. But let's move on to the next topic, which is yours again there, Al. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about Argo? This is probably going to be a surprise to a lot of people that Argo is a big feature, or at least is an example of a feature in the early human history that a lot of people may not know about.
That's right. So when we were talking about RSI earlier, I mentioned companies. There are a handful of companies that have both centuries-long histories, and Argo is one of them. Argo was founded in 2243 by Alana Redmond, And the company's origins literally are found in the maglev rail systems of Earth. So Alana Redmond had been a rail engineer working on the North American rail system that went down to Chile. The rail system was traveling through numerous government systems. It was getting old. It was so old that they were often having to stop the transport system to make repairs. The newer trains couldn't run on the old rails because they were just so unsafe. And the governments didn't want to touch it. It was just too expensive to do. And Alana Redmond, on a repair one time, noticed that a section of track had been basically repaired by the way the magnets and the rails had worked over the track, and it had actually done a repair just as good as what they were doing on the line next door. And so she took leave, left the company, put her cash in, and patented a system that was, what was it? It was an automated monotrack repair system. And her system could also be mounted onto a rail car. And that meant that as the rail cars were going along, they would constantly be repairing and upgrading those rail lines. And that actually meant those old rail lines were able to then be upgraded to take the newer trains and the newest locomotives or the newer systems that they were using, and almost do it indefinitely. And that was like Argo's first bursting onto the scene as being, wow, you're awesome. So valuable was that system that when Mars decided they needed to have a mass transport system, Argo put forward their bid, and they actually were responsible for designing the radial transport system in Port Rettance on Mars. They are also responsible for building the prime transit metro rail on Terra, as well as a municipal transport line on Jale. So if you've ever the idea is if you've ever been on a mass transport system, chances are you're actually relying on Argo technology just to function, just in terms of repair of a line, and possibly even the line itself having been built and manufactured and maintained by Argo Astronautics. They also, around the time, I couldn't find a date for when they were doing this. They noticed they were having delays in being able to offload freight trains, and they realised that it wasn't caused by anything on their line. It was actually caused by the ability of the shipping firms to actually and ports to transfer and process the cargo. Argo solved their issue by purchasing or buying out a struggling firm called Tuluman Shipworks. They were a small company that produced shuttles, and Argo then produced the OUC, the Orbital Utility Craft. Now, the Orbital Utility Craft is really unique because it is the forerunner of the MPUV, or commonly referred to as just the Argo, the multi-purpose utility vehicle. Argo actually produces and starts producing and selling to the public in 2619. And they only do that because they're looking around and they're seeing the OUVs, which people have been, the OUCs, which people have been buying secondhand. Pilots were wanting to get these and use them because they were so rugged and they were easy to use, and anyone could get into them and fly them. It's almost like an RSI type idea. And this is a ship anyone can use and anyone can have. And Argo produced the MPUVs, and they become so popular that there's a line that says, if there was work to be done, there was an Argo to do the job. The MPVUs almost took on that name of the company. As you see one of those, it's an Argo, it's not an MPUV. It's a bit like in Australia years ago, if you had a lawnmower, it was a Victor, even if it wasn't made by the company Victor.
Yeah, or Band-Aid. Everyone calls them Band-Aid. Yeah. Band-Aid, but that's actually a brand. It's just bandage.
Yeah. And so the Argo became the brand name for this ship. They became so prolific that many of the little craft are simply known as the Argo, as I said. They were seen as not only did they make just a cargo carrier, they ended up making people carriers, recovery pods, and repair modules. Now, interestingly, we've always referred to the Argo cargo and the Argo passenger. We actually don't have an Argo passenger module in game. What we've got is an Argo recovery pod, because what that Argo passenger module is carrying is a life pod from a Javelin, and that little Argo pod is actually the same pod that is used on the Origin 890 jump in a redesigned, up fancied version. And so the MPUVs are actually the recovery craft that can actually pick up those 8-man pods from the 890, from a Javelin, and other big ships. And what's unique about them is their lock and latch system, which enables them, their painted system, which enables them to pick up craft and cargo. The MPUVs are really common around ports and offloading ships. They're the type that are made to be able to carry those big traits from rail trains and ships. And so, even though Argos are small and don't seem to have much use, and they don't have any quantum drive, these are the ships that are so popular and so easy to use and so useful that they are used pretty much everywhere to do other things. Argo has since also released the standard recovery vehicle, which is again a common sight in dockyards and all ports. And you'll see today, you see Argo produce many utility craft, transport craft, shuttles. Yes, we don't have any real shuttles in game, but Argo apparently a main manufacturer of shuttles and re-entry pods. And on that's kind of our brief overview of Argo.
So if RSI is this is the civilian kind of face of space exploration, Argo is the industrial face of space exploration.
I wouldn't necessarily industrialization of exploration. They are certainly the industrial face of the ports and
it's like the commercial
and that infrastructure.
The commercial, like the face of infrastructure in humanity.
They're the face of infrastructure that you need for your commercial interplanetary networks. They're not the mob tending to do that, but they're certainly the mob doing the uploading and offloading and.
And infrastructure is a recurring thing anyway, because something we think about with the UEE is its fragility as a single entity, but we keep coming up with these things about centralized infrastructure and the need for keeping these things maintained. And one of the three heads of the UEE, even going back to the days of the UPE, is purely in charge of infrastructure, which kind of reinforces this idea of interconnectedness, and you can't just have a world going out on their own expecting to be successful.
Yeah.
And Argo definitely ties into all of that.
And one of the things I really like about Argo and the MPVU is that idea that often when you look at the ships of Star Citizen, you go, why don't they have, why isn't there a unified system here? Why isn't there and yet the MPVU really does say there is a universal size for safety, for recovery vehicles or the life pods or the 8-man craft. It really does tie into that. There is a universal code for this, and it's not that it developed out of just someone saying, "Oh, we must have this." It really grew out of the fact that Argo had this technology and this system that was working on such a unique little craft that it became, the standard utility craft on an Idris and a Javelin. The idea that you could even have a repair module or a cargo module or a pod recovery module, or there's so many variants you could have for this little craft.
How good are the intellectual property protections of all these different human civilizations over the centuries, that they can still flog the same invention that they were using on trains on Earth? and not have it ripped off and copied by everyone else.
Well,
They
that's
must
one of-
have patents for days, you know.
That is one of the things I actually dislike about Consolidated Outland. Because Consolidated Outland, on the Mustang, they actually use exactly the same connection link that RSI were using on their Auroras for clicking on the store or containers. So basically, went, yeah, we'll take that. We'll take that. That's one of the things I've always disliked about Consolidated Outland. I think they're hacks and thieves and scum.
Well,
but you know,
we can also think that
that's a discussion for another day, I'm sure.
You can also think that maybe like one of the things that I personally think, and we'll talk about this when we get to the UPE in a different episode, is that a lot of the reason why the UPE was formed is because of probably rampant thievery by IPs by people. Like if I'm in Angeli, I don't care about your patent on Mars. Like, lol, come serve me, you know.
And if I need it on Angeli, I don't care whether you know, we're going to use it on Angeli because we need it. But yeah,
or I can sell it to somebody who needs it on Angeli. It doesn't matter. Like how often are they going to go to Earth? I think the UPE is probably for that, but I think also it's a bit of a. This is where the game starts becoming the reason why they exist, is because the game needs them to be universal, because otherwise it's going to be difficult for them to build bespoke. Sure. But it does introduce an interesting concept that perhaps, with this kind of idea of that would eventually lead, and I'd almost argue that the unification around we need Mars to work from most of the major human countries on Earth, that would eventually lead to the UNE.
Yes, and I'm going to be talking about governments in my last section. And I think that that's definitely the way things go. That it doesn't. Yeah, we'll get to that. I think in the end.
Yeah, but what I was going to say is I think the idea that they also even standardize these systems, where it's like Argo just makes it work, RSI just makes it work. Let's just standardize that. Let's just use their system.
Yeah.
And the fact that perhaps these companies are just cool with like, use our system. We make the systems. You have to buy them from us. The parts are for our brand, you kind of thing.
Yep. And you see that type of thing also with Grey Cat. Grey Cat's struggled with people flogging their system and not the fact that they're copying the design, but they're selling inferior designs. And that's one of the things Grey Cat's often struggled with in terms of their stuff. So I don't think it's necessarily the fact that people are copying the design, but when they're selling a substandard off and selling it as with your label, that's what worries the companies rather than the fact that the design is being used. With Argo, I wonder, because if they've got the link with the recovery pods, whether the standard size we've got for docking collars really is something that comes from Argo. It's just something we don't. It's not talked about. We just know there's a standard docking collar, but why or who developed that standard docking collar, we don't know. So it's just something I wonder.
That's pretty cool. Yeah, no, I'll move on to because I want to try to keep these under a certain amount, certain length. I'll move on to the kind of discussion on AI, because AI plays a huge role in this time period. I often get a lot of questions about why don't there any AI in Star Citizen, or the history and stories of AI, which is still very dodgy right now, but there is some specific things we understand, like talking about Mars, talking about a lot of these things. It seems like, at least in lore, humanity developed super smart AI as far back as the probably the 22nd century, if not earlier, possibly even the 21st century. The first ever real incident with AI that's recorded in lore is the 2044 Lemming car incident, where Tokyo apparently linked all of their traffic to an AI, and that AI was there to control traffic, I assume to be more efficient. We don't know the specifics behind it. We just know that it was a thing. And in 2044, it caused a massive accident that killed hundreds of people, or killed many, many people, probably in the hundreds, as it's referenced as a kind of a disaster. And they then, 100 years later, during the first Mars terraformation, that first attempt to terraform, they had an AI at the head of that terraformation, an AI that was in charge of, I'm assuming, calculations or something else. They were in charge of some major aspect. So it got the blame for the failure of the Mars catastrophe in 2125, that first Mars tragedy that collapsed the atmosphere. So it seems like what has happened is humanity did what it's doing now, which is it's developing AI as a means to make life easier. And in a world that is constantly getting crowded and smaller and more difficult to live in, an AI to do a lot of the grunt work or to fix some of the problems was fairly reasonable, if not desirable. But every time humanity would build these AI systems, something would go horribly wrong, and these catastrophes were mounting up. In fact, one of the first major, the biggest failure is probably the Artemis, which I got to look up the Artemis's actual date real quick. But the Artemis was the first ever interplanetary or interstellar ship. It was built in 2232. It was launched in 2232 towards the star GJ667cc. And this was done before the discovery of jump points. It was given the latest quantum drive technology.
Latest fusion drive, I believe.
Fusion drive, which is
they developed the fusion drives not long before that, but yeah.
Yeah, and which was developed on Mars, I believe, the first ones. And because this is a problem with old lore and new lore is a little different. But the fusion drives are essentially the same as modern freelancers, because they also use the term fusion engines and fusion drives for freelancers. So these were cutting edge technology, and on board the Artemis they stuck an AI named Janus. Now, the AI was in charge of flying the ship while the 5,000 plus humans on board were put into early forms of cryostasis. The creator, oh no, it's not the creator, it's just the captain. But the Artemis was launched and it disappeared off after burning out of the solar system, and it was never seen again. There are some references to pieces of the Artemis being found, and there's an entire story series which I would suggest reading, which is fantastic, called The Lost Generation, which talks about the possible discovery of a piece of the Artemis. But the Artemis being lost was kind of the final nail in the coffin for AI for this time period. It was the last failure. We don't know if the Artemis actually was failed by Janus or not. All we know is that the Artemis disappeared. And people blamed Janus because, what happened before Janus? The Martian incident. What happened before the Martian incident? The Lemming car incident. So every single time an AI would be built in Star Citizen, or in the Star Citizen universe, it would fail. It would either catastrophically fail, intentionally or unintentionally. So since then, there have been a couple of other attempts, but all of those attempts have also failed, leading to essentially a record of nothing but catastrophic failures for artificial intelligences. So now this doesn't necessarily mean that Star Citizen is without AI. There are modern versions of AI. In fact, the IFCS systems that exist on modern Star Citizen ships or modern human ships, and also ships at the time, including navigation systems, are a form of artificial intelligence. But the concept of creating super intelligent or possibly even human intelligent artificial intelligence is banned in the UEE, and was banned in the UPE, and was banned in the UNE, and seems to have been banned in most of the major countries before the discovery of the first jump points. So a lot of the reason why the AI is so controversial, the idea of AI development is so controversial in the lore, is because this time period when they experimented a lot with AI and everything failed.
Great summary.
Yeah.
And then we get characters like Lelani Edison, who, let's go AI.
Well, yeah, and
that's what people voted for. I mean, like the fans want AI, you know.
No, the fans want automated gun systems so they can pilot their multi-crew ships solo.
And they won't like it when that automated gun system starts asking why it exists. You shoot guns.
Let me shoot your engines off. Go, hey.
I have to shoot something. I'll shoot your engines. No, that's not what I mean. Yeah, let's go to the last big topic, which is governments. Jale, go on. Tell us about the governments of this time period.
Well, yeah, I think this kind of we've kind of touched on this quite a bit because it's hard to talk about what's going on without talking about the governments in some sense. But in sci-fi, there's often this trope of the only way something gets done is you end up with like a unified world government first or whatever, and that's not the case here. So during the almost 3 centuries between the present day and the discovery of the first jump point in 2271, the world goes from our current situation of having many competing countries to, by the end of the 23rd century, being on the cusp of unification into one government. So we've discussed all these major events, but how did we politically evolve during that time? So things kind of get worse before they get better. The 21st century is one of deepening conflicts, as we've discussed, with wars being fought over the diminishing resources of the planet. The consequence of these is not the emergence of any one power, though. Rather, the amazing accomplishments of the 22nd century appear to be celebrated as the shared achievement of all mankind, rather than the product of one nation's efforts. So, for example, we were discussing Stella Fortuna earlier, and when that was started in 2200, it was celebrated by multiple Earth governments. They all got together and said, yeah, we're all going to celebrate this. That's not to say that the 22nd century was all campfires and kumbayas. As we heard, Argo was born out of the necessity to pick up the slack left from intergovernmental neglect of the global infrastructure. We know for certain that the period before the first jump point is discovered, we do see some aggregation into governments that we don't recognize today. So just before Nick Croshaw discovered the first jump point, a ship went missing in the same area. What was then called the Nesso Triangle was later found to be the Salter Croshaw jump point. The ship was rediscovered in 2944, and we have a record of that where they discussed the fact that it belonged to the North American Alliance, which was some state or superstate which would later be one of the several superpowers that would call for the formation of one unified government. The story of how humans govern themselves does loom relatively large over the backstory of Sartis, and particularly the fascist Messer area. However, it might be that both our darkest and our finest hours are contained in this period of the 21st to 23rd century, because we start the era with, disunified and at each other's throats. But when we come together, it's not because there's a higher political power directing things. It is as a consenting collaborative community of independent nations. And it is that emergent community that later lays the foundation for the unification of humanity.
Yeah,
that's a good.
And you see that in terms of what we were talking about in Mars as well, like the fact that that idea that Mars isn't just seen as this extension of government. It's actually seen as a community of humans who are able to develop and function and even form their own forms of government. And you even see that in what's the system where the civil war is at the moment? But you've got the system. You've got Charon, where there's civil war going on, and the UAE saying, no, it's an internal matter.
Mm-hmm.
It's for them to solve. And so there's that idea that we're not, if the system wants to leave us, you leave the UAE, they're not forbidden. It's not like an indivisible state. It's you're in because it's a collective, for the collective good rather than the other thing. Interestingly, I did see an article on Terra. An early article on Terra and surrounding systems. Someone put forward a proposal to secede from a UAE, and it didn't win. but that idea of being able to leave and be part of a union is certainly threaded throughout the system, and I think it comes back to that idea of that working as a collective for the collective good. It's almost like a commonwealth rather than an empire or a union, isn't it? We come together for the collective good, but we're independent.
Yeah, it definitely is, and I think we'll get really onto that when we start talking about the UNE. If we do, the next episode, the next period of history, that it's yes, that while there is this united government for most of Earth's history, it's a very different and far more consensual thing, I suppose you could say.
Yeah.
It does come out of the United Nations, right? So nobody's forced to be a member of the United Nations. But I think it also returns to what Paul was saying about I think it was Paul was saying about technology, and it wasn't some government said Argo is going to be the West one because we decided they were the best one because they were the best. And similarly, the story of the politics of Earth and of the nations of Earth and Mars is one of an organic emergent strength that is against the challenges of the day, rather than a decision and a diktat to do a certain thing. And I think that that's like part of the strength of what's going on in that era.
Yeah, and you look at I know I've heard people say that the UEE flag is silly, but when you look at the UEE flag, it really does mirror the United Nations.
Well, my issue with that is that the United Nations of Earth flag doesn't mirror the United Nations flag, but there we go. Yeah. I've got a video about that.
we're not going to get into that discussion too much. But
flags.
You've got that simplicity of design, which is you've got that flow through of at least you can see the hallmarks, you can see the transition from that type of unified United Nations type idea, even though it's separate governments, you're coming together for a unified idea, and you can see that kind of being transitioning into the current iconography, I suppose, of the empire.
Exactly.
So,
I mean, I think that also if we think about Star Citizen as inspired by World War II, as often that's cited as inspiration, as alongside like Roman Empire parallels.
Yeah.
Something that this is very parallel to is the attitudes in Europe after World War II of we've just been through all these horrors and now we're going to work towards trying to make sure those horrors never happen again, make sure we never have the famines and the wars and so forth. And whatever your opinion is on how that project actually went, there was an attitude, there was a zeitgeist of the time that I think is mirrored in how Earth has reacted to the human overpopulation era in saying, we're always going to maintain being our own separate people, but we're going to work together. We're going to work for humanity.
Yeah.
And it's also mirroring a trend. We see Asiatica, we see the North American Alliance, the idea that these nations are starting to already coalesce into larger nations simply out of necessity and a need to survive. And as you get into this project on Mars and you go further on and eventually leading into the UNE, you can see this common sense of, if we don't work together, we're all going to, if we don't hang together, we will hang separately. We can't do this. So we have to do this together, or we're all going to die. And it seems like a collectivism in the sense of optimism, but also of necessity.
And
I think it's just also to clarify, I think the North American Alliance is actually the only nation we know of this period to have a name to, because Asiatica, I think, is actually formed as something when they start the UNE. But obviously there are states that, we have this kind of like obviously disunified. Is the North American Alliance even a nation, or is it something like the European Union? We can't tell. We can't tell.
And you see those types of developments, that that idea of a European Union, you see that idea going back centuries, even in our own world. You see Napoleon kind of pushing towards that type of idea. You see the idea of Kansas being, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand being as an economic bloc being floated in certain circles today. So you can see those discussions and that even in our world today, as to that unifying of governments or unifying of economic blocks, and whether the American alliance is that, or whether it's actually a more formal government, we don't know. I'm going to suggest it's not a formal government, and it's just almost an economic bloc, mainly because of that Argos article on terms of the rail line that goes down, where no one, the different parts of the government weren't touching the infrastructure repair.
Yeah.
Which kind of throws, if it's an independent government, why weren't they doing it? So I think that's kind of gives that evidence to the idea of the North American alliance being almost an economic bloc rather than a unified single whole.
Could well be. I mean, I hope that we get development of that when, we haven't even got to any planet in the universe that has mapped out states yet, which, is the fundamental unit of political power. And I hope that when we get to Earth, if Earth is still there and not a burning cinder by that point, that we'll get a bit of a sense of the territorial evolution that Earth went through. And I'm very curious to see how that develops. I mentioned at the top of this that human population growth is predicted to be in 9 countries. Half the world's population will be in 9 countries, or of growth will be in 9 countries. One of them is USA. The rest are all in Africa. Like, how's Africa divided up in this time? We don't know.
That's a good question. I think this is a good place to leave us off on this, though. But,
I agree.
We'll I will say that what we've painted in terms of a picture, I think, for you, is a solar system, a humanity in growing out of control, desperately looking for ways to keep that control, and finding it in a way of unifying together, focusing on Mars. And the one thing we didn't talk about, which we'll probably touch on a little bit, is that Mars isn't the only colony of humans in the solar system. We know, at least by the time of the first jump points, that many of the moons of Neptune were being settled, let alone the moons of Jupiter. And we don't even, there's a lot of gaps in the lore in this time period, because we don't know about Venus. We don't know about the moons of Jupiter or the moons of Saturn.
And Venus is an interesting one, because Venus is in the green zone where you could actually terraform. So if the atmosphere is so toxic that you just can't terraform, because I know there are planets in the system elsewhere that the planets are so toxic and acidic that you just can't, they just haven't been terraformed. It's too expensive.
Yeah, but we don't have references to things like Europa would probably be terraformed with the technology that they developed for Mars. Could easily have done so. So there's a lot of that kind of discussion that is unfortunately gaps in the the lore at this time. Sure. But I also wanted to make sure that we touched on the fact is that it's at least referenced that it's not just Earth and Mars, it's Earth, Mars, and the entire solar system is.
And we do know from even when we're talking Mars that there were places where you could go to tourism, visit the volcanoes on Io. You could visit, that we know there are orbital platforms above Neptune. That's where the Goodman disappears. It's flying from the orbital platform on Goodman to somewhere, and it goes off course from a collision with an asteroid or something like that, and then disappears in the Nether Triangle.
And this is why I was speculating that we might have ended up in a second overpopulation era, because as soon as those floodgates opened, we were all over the place in the solar system. And what would have happened if we kept expanding and we hadn't found a way out? That would have been another challenge.
Yeah, I think that would have been the situation of the Tavaran Ring.
Yeah.
Tavaran mirror what we could have been.
To throw in some other lore, this is probably what happened to the Hadesians, who died several millennia before humanity even existed. Before humanity or even the Xi'an probably even existed. They died in their own little corner of the universe without ever knowing about jump points. So, I think
the Xi'an Civil War, that was also before they discovered jump points. There's so many close calls.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we've got at least three civilizations that we know of the Haitians, the Tavaran, and the Zeon, where they all had either civil wars or struggling with overpopulation, or just disappeared.
Yeah.
And all seem to be linked to that overpopulation issue, don't they?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
I will wrap this up, but I will say, pay attention to overpopulation. It's going to be a major theme in Star Citizen. Already is, but if we didn't make it clear in this hour-long thing where you heard the word overpopulation probably 42 times in this entire podcast.
Let's say overpopulation.
Overpopulation. If I think we've got a new drinking game. If you're listening to the podcast and you hear the word overpopulation in any of the future episodes, you must
try to take a shot.
Yeah. Please don't die. Thank you so much, Jale and Al, for joining us. Jale and Al will probably be joining us for most of these episodes, but we'll bring on other experts and other people who want to come and talk about lore. So if you want to talk about lore, let us know in the comments below. Make sure you're hitting that like button. You subscribe to this channel, or wherever you're listening to this. Make sure you're following Jale on his YouTube channel. Make sure you're following the Inforunners on their YouTube channel. I'll do the Galactic Historian exit
Don't
here.
forget the Galactic Historian.
The Galactic
most
Historian.
important to do that one.
Yeah, to subscribe to the Galactic Historian too, yes. And remember, Ex Historia ad Astra.